our task is really to kick off the discussion, plant some ideas, and get the discussion, having the discussion with all of you is crucial. We think this is an extremely important moment. I've been saying for the last month or so, whenever I get a chance to speak in opportunities like this, is that we really don't know the outcome of what's going on at this moment in Cuba. I don't think anyone can predict. Washington, Wall Street has a knife to the throat of Cuba. That's the reality that we face. We don't know what's going to happen. One thing, though, however, we do know, and that is Washington and Wall Street will not be able to erase the 6 or 7 year history of the Cuban Revolution. History that will be crucial, precious, in my opinion, for the making of the second socialist revolution in the Americas. And knowing those lessons and trying to absorb, and that's exactly what we want to kick off for this discussion tonight. It's my opinion. By the way, my opinion is my opinion, not the opinion of the Minnesota Cuba Committee. The Minnesota Cuba Committee has all kinds of different opinions. All we ask is that people, if you're willing to support, oppose the embargo and the blockade, normalization of relations with Cuba, United States out of Guantanamo. I think that's our basic program. Yeah, we don't have anything more complicated than that. And anybody's welcome to be a part of the committee if you're in agreement with those things. But it's my opinion that Cuba is the only living example of a socialist revolution in today's world. It's the only living example. Again, other people may have different opinions about that. And that itself is worthy of an explanation. How did it happen? How do you explain Cuban exceptionalism? Why is it that Cuba is the only living example of a socialist revolution in the world? So knowing the lessons, this is why I'm here. Knowing the lessons of the Cuban Revolution are crucial. They're crucial in trying to make sense of that in order to be able to go forward. I'll come back to that in a minute. There's another thing I want to talk a little bit about. How did we get to this moment where Washington is in a position now to hold a dagger, a knife to Cuba's throat? How do we explain that? How do we make sense of it? And then lastly, let's think a little bit about solidarity work and how do we go for what do we do now with regard to solidarity work in defense of the Cuban Revolution. Those are the 3 things I'd like to focus on. The victory 65 years ago, today on April the 19th, was extraordinary. Had a major impact on politics, world politics. Caused all kinds of things to open up. It's what brought a lot of people into politics in the United States at that moment. It opened up space, political space, to do work, to do political work. It brought together organizations who had once been serious political differences to be able to cooperate and to work together. I want to come back and really think about future and going forward for solidarity work. The big lesson for me is why was Cuba successful boils down basically to what happened before April 19th. The 2 years leading up to April 19th. That set of developments was crucial in understanding why the workers and toilers came out to defend their revolution. The question is, how did they get to that? 3 decades after the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, which was July 26, 1953, for Fidel Castro gave a speech 3 decades later, and in that speech he really synthesized, I thought, the essence in understanding why the victory on April 19th. How did our people become a socialist people? It was the revolutionary laws more than words, preaching or reasoning what made our people socialist. When rents were cut, which profoundly affected the interests of those landlords, the entire people supported the measure. When the agrarian reform was carried out, the entire people supported the decision. The interests of the workers were taken care of. Social justice was implemented with a strong hand from one end of the country to the other. For the first time in our country's history, the state and the government ceased being on the side of the rich and put themselves on the side of the poor. When the vast majority of our population saw that the government resolutely attacked the interests of the rich and of the bourgeoisie to support the people, little by little, all of those lies and that whole anti-socialist and anti-communist campaign came tumbling down. Like a house of cards. In this way, a new political thinking, a true political awareness was created among our people. I think it gets to the very heart of why the United States backed mercenary lost. They lost on April the 19th. As one of the leaders of the resistance in the fight, one of the generals said, the problem with the mercenaries is that they really didn't have anything to fight for. Whereas the Cuban toilers had something to fight for. These gains they had made. And what Castro explains is, shortly after taking power on January 1st, 1959, the new government began to act immediately to address the needs of the toilers in Cuba for the first time. Acted immediately. What's striking to me about his explanation is exactly what happened four decades earlier in 1917. In 1917, in the Bolshevik Revolution. As soon as the Bolsheviks came to power, they immediately began to act and to begin to carry out measures to meet the immediate needs of the population. That goes a long way in explaining why the Bolsheviks were successful in the invasion that took place. The 13 capitalist countries that invaded the Soviet Union to try to overthrow the revolution. Not unlike the mercenaries 4 decades later. The mercenaries 4 decades later were defeated in 72 hours. What happened in the Soviet Union was very bloody. It lasted almost 3 years. 14 countries invaded. But exactly because of the measures that the new Bolshevik government enacted immediately to satisfy their needs. These peasants now have something, the land reform, the withdrawal of Russia from the war. Peace, land, and freedom. Peace, land, and bread. That was the slogans of the Bolshevik campaign. And I'm struck by how remarkable the two most consequential revolutions of the 20th century were carried out in a similar way. The new government acted immediately to satisfy the needs of the toilers. And therefore the toilers had something to defend. This is why the mercenaries lost, and this is why the 14 imperialist countries, their armies that they supported, they also lost after 2.5 years. The peasantry has something to fight for. And I think therein an important lesson. All too often we've seen in the 20th century revolutions that call themselves socialists but fail to act immediately to meet the needs of the toilers. Fail to act immediately. So to me that's the first important takeaway. Again, I'm just throwing this out so we can elaborate and talk about it later. Secondly, why is it Washington is able to do something now that it couldn't do in 1960? Going back and reading for the first time a speech that Fidel Castro gave 3 days later after the victory on April the 23rd. He goes into this fascinating speech. I never read it, but just really synthesizes the victory, the changes that had taken place. And in that speech, he talks about how Washington thought it could strangle the revolution to death by denying petroleum going into Russia. That was in 1960, 61. That was what Washington thought it could do. And at that moment, the Cubans found a savior. They found the Soviet Union. It came through and helped them provide it with the petroleum. The companies, the U.S. refineries, didn't want to refine it, which gave the revolution the reason. No, we will nationalize you. And so in 1960, the United States was not able to strangle the revolution by denying it the preciously needed petroleum. That was solved then. Today, that's not the case. There is no Soviet Union any longer. Washington will permit Putin to send petroleum, but only at Washington's will. Only at Washington's will. That too requires an explanation. How do we get to that? I'm simply throwing that out. But the fact is that Washington is able to do what it can do is because the working class is not in power. I think we have to come to that sober realization. And Washington will do what it's doing. It can do what it's doing. Not only in regard to Cuba, but also with regard to humanity as a whole. The world looks increasingly like the lead up to the First World War. Economic competition, the fight over resources, the fight over markets, that was the lead up to the First World War. Capitalist competition. And what's so dangerous now, and we know that economic wars oftentimes lead to shooting wars. And in this instance, nuclear weapons. So it's not just about Cuba that we're talking about humanity as a whole. What happens, the problem, the reality we have to face, as long as political power is in the hands of the capitalists, the imperialists, and so on, we all face an existential threat. And this can only be remedied. It can only be remedied if we do what our cohorts, our comrades in Cuba did 67 years ago, to take political power. That, to me, is the other big lesson of this. And again, we can come back and discuss it. Thirdly, in terms of solidarity work, I was reading this book, this great Pathfinder collection about the first solidarity work, Cuba solidarity work here in Minnesota. It's called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And it came out it came into existence right before the Bay of Pigs, but really took off the ground around the Bay of Pigs. It was a very different climate, very different climate. Now, sometimes I hear people bemoaning the fact how bad things are in the United States. What we just did outside with that picket line, in 1961, people who were doing something similar were attacked by more than 1,000 people, called the Young Americans for Freedom, in front of Coughlin Union at the University of Minnesota. People who were trying to defend the Cuban Revolution were attacked by the Young Americans, much larger forces. It was a different period, McCarthyism, the witch hunt, and all of that in that moment. Yeah, we couldn't have, what we just did, we were being attacked by large forces in that particular moment. I stress that to talk about how much has changed. The opportunities we have today, to come together collectively to do solidarity work, and we must take advantage of those opportunities. To work with others, people we may have political disagreements with, but who are in agreement that the need to defend the Cuban Revolution is crucial at this moment. That's what happened in 1960-61 when the Fair Play Cuba Committee came into existence. existence. The Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, came together, other forces who had not cooperated before, came together to form the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. At a certain moment, Minnesota was sort of in the vanguard for Cuba work. In a little college south of Minneapolis called Carleton College, they had a very active chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And that committee was really very much in vanguard and cooperated with a few students here at the University of Minnesota. 1990, fast forward to 1999, and that's how the Minnesota-Cuba Committee came into existence. The Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party issued a statement, got a number of groups assigned on to it. And we called a meeting, as Rebecca mentioned, in April of 1990 at the Zion Baptist Church up in North Minneapolis. We had about 40 people who came out, not unlike the 40 people who attended the reception we had for the ambassador. And out of that meeting in North Minneapolis, that collection, that's how the Minnesota-Cuba Committee came into existence. We were not always called the Minnesota-Cuba Committee. We had actually about three different names. The first one was called the Twin Cities Cuba Friendship Society. The Friendship Society. And that, anybody knows about politics will know, well, the friendship, why it was in that label. To accommodate people who had different political perspectives and so on. We changed our name later. I say that because, as far as I'm concerned here, but none of us are weighted to the label Minnesota-Cuba Committee. We'll change that if necessary for us to come together collectively and do solidarity and solidarity work. So yes, those are the three things I just wanted to leave with, and thank you.
Thank you so much, August. That was really inspiring. I think we can hold questions for both August and Ricardo until we get done with both of the speeches. One thing that August mentioned about solidarity work is that, we can kind of all come together on these common mutual goals. SCOTA, the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, and all of the co-endorsers of this event, which include the National Lawyers Guild, Witness for Peace, Socialist Workers Party, Veterans for Peace Local Chapter 27, and I think there are a few more I may be forgetting. Our goals are really, as August was saying, to remove the over 6-decade inhumane blockade against Cuba, to remove Cuba off of what's called the SSOT, the State Sponsor of Terrorism list, to end Trump's recent oil blockade and maximum pressure campaign against Cuba, and to return Guantanamo Bay to the Cuban people where it rightfully should be. So please, if you feel so inclined, we welcome you to join our work, our solidarity work, and you can get in touch with August, with Carla, Jairus, Marcy, myself, Sandy, Gary. Many people here would be willing to help and get you involved more if you feel like you have the energy for that. And our next speaker is Ricardo Levins Morales. He has been working in social justice movements everywhere he has found himself throughout the world, and he primarily uses art as a tool and a medium to express struggles for liberation, and he has always been very much in solidarity with the Cuban people and has worked for Cuba here locally as well. So thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you. And thank you, August. I knew I could count on August to do some large framing, so I insisted that he go first. So then I could just sort of ping along these different scent trails and bring up some specific nutrients from this long story of the Cuban Revolution. So yeah, the Playa Giron, the Bay of Pigs invasion, happened when I was 5 years old. And I grew up in Puerto Rico, in a Puerto Rico whose development and trajectory was tremendously impacted by the Cuban Revolution. Looking out from our farm on the top of the Central Mountain Range toward the Dominican Republic and the Mona Channel to the west, I could see on Monte del Estado the silver radio towers of a CIA jamming station, whose purpose was to prevent Cuban radio signals from reaching Puerto Rican ears, right? To prevent the contagion, as they put it, from happening. For a number of reasons. Cuba was an example that they didn't want others to follow. Cuba provided solidarity and refuge for people very much the same way that Haiti did in an earlier era, the dawn of the 19th century, when the Haitian Revolution provided safe harbor to Simón Bolívar when other options for support had dwindled. And in fact, the blockade of Cuba also echoes that of Haiti. When Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800, he really tightened the screws on blockading, joining with other nations to blockade the Haitian Revolution to prevent contagion. For example, for trade with other countries, Haiti had to transfer any goods to the ships of Western powers at the edge of their territorial waters, so that Haitian crews would not land in the other colonies of the Americas and spread the contagion of revolutionary ideas. Right? So that idea of containment and the danger of these ideas spreading. That's what Monte del Estado was about. Now, Cuba has played an outsized role in world history since 1959. And it started like so many, as August alluded to, it started like so many revolutions in Latin America, which are expected to follow a particular course. Firebrand leaders talking big about the needs of the people, winning victory, whether it's through armed struggle or through election, and quickly caving into the imperial powers, and business as usual continued. That's what many expected would happen in Cuba. Certainly what the U.S. expected. The U.S., just as they recognized the Haitian government at the beginning, they were very happy to make friends with Cuba initially, in the expectation it would follow that normal course. And in fact, it was not until the land reform, or the agrarian reform, was announced that, first of all, many people in the elites, both at home and abroad there, felt the sting of betrayal. They thought, these people are doing what they promised. That is a total betrayal of trust. Because that's not how the game is played. But it was also a moment of tremendous relief, even for many people who had participated in the revolution, to have that assurance that, dang, we really are going to do this, because it's, wasn't written in stone. And to kind of riff off of what August was saying, yeah, in some ways you could say that the victory at Playa Giron can be traced to the day that the agrarian reform was announced, right? Now, Puerto Rico was really the showpiece of the Alliance for Progress, which was a direct response to the Cuban Revolution. That was Kennedy's program to spread reformist governments and economic reforms throughout Latin America to show that revolution is not necessary. And Puerto Rico would be the showcase of that. And ironically, even as when Cuba was thriving in ways that it's difficult to maintain today, Puerto Rico has continually deteriorated in terms of health outcomes, pollution, job prospects, land use, and all the rest, public health. And the Alliance for Progress is part of the kind of ebb and flow of the waves of history as they've run through Latin America, with the Alliance for Progress spreading these ideas that, okay, the Americanos are going to bring reform and meet our needs, leading to raised expectations, and then people taking that seriously and organizing to demand more, or even electing governments to demand more, leading to the backlash and the imposition of dictatorships, and leading to the 1965 U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic. Those radio signals did listen to us. We could hear that in real time from our mountain. Leading to another wave of guerrilla movements and the crushing of those guerrilla movements or the cooptation, and leading to the neoliberal decade and the lost decade in Latin America, leading to the pink revolution movements, right? You have these ebbs and flows, each kind of as a reaction to the one before. And Puerto Rico was supposed to be, as a direct colony, the place where the U.S. can demonstrate the magic of what they call democracy. So I just want to throw, what's most remarkable about the Cuban Revolution is its internal nature, right? The internal dynamics, what it has meant to the 10 million Cubans, right? But there are also some other factors to throw in. One of the things, when we talk about what allowed it to be successful and to really center those revolutionary ideals that sparked it, there's a number of things, and some of them are strategic. Some of them are circumstantial. When our ancestors would create arrowheads and spearheads out of flint and be chipping that flint, it's an exacting art to learn the way the stone is structured so that you basically separate the parts that you want to separate and remain with the part that you want to remain. That's true in revolutions too. You want to polarize society, create division in ways that keep the majority of the people with you and the minority against you, right? That's what we try to do. It's possible to break it in the wrong way in a number of ways. Sometimes you have too much of a majority on your side. So this is what happened in the Philippines in the People's Revolution to overthrow the Marcos regime. It was, radical movements that were surging. But the thing is that the elites in the Philippines had been blocked from sharing in the wealth and the plunder of the Marcos regime. So they felt pretty alienated. And there was no room for promotion within the system. The Marcos family was hoarding everything for themselves. So with this revolutionary movement, they're like, we can jump on that horse. And we can declare ourselves the leaders of it. And we can put forth our candidates and shut out everybody else. And so Corazon Aquino, a landowner, part of the landowning elite, was able to move in. So the flints had been broken at the wrong place. A section of the elite steps up, and we see this over and over again, and takes the benefits of the revolution to make sure that it's never really fulfilled. In Cuba, the Cuban elites were depleted. They were totally subservient to U.S. corporations. They had no instinct for self-preservation or even their own identity. So when the Batista coup took place, they didn't really have any oomph to them. And the student movement, including the movements that the parties that Fidel and others were involved in, they organized cells. They were all ready, said, we're all ready to move when our leaders tell us to. Leaders didn't do shit, right? And they figured we're on our own, ultimately. But what it meant was that the revolutionary coalition did not contain members of the elite. It did not contain landowners who needed to be mollified. It did not contain elements of the military the way it did in the Philippines, so that they were able to define their own identity, right? And of course, the revolutionary movement that came out of the Sierra Maestra was the tip of an iceberg, if you forget that very non-Caribbean metaphor. of a coalition of campesinos, workers, and students, but not landowners, business owners, and so forth, right? So that's another thing. It started out without the weight of having to compromise with members of the coalition that brought them to power, who were loyal to imperialism and to the elite because they weren't there. Do I have any time left?
Yeah.
Beautiful. So, another thing we have to recognize, of course, is that any attempts at revolution that meets people's needs, whether it's within a framework of liberal, reformist, or revolutionary, or nonviolent electoral, if it tries to fulfill those expectations, will meet with withering opposition, with sabotage, with violence, with economic warfare, and that takes a toll, and that is meant to minimize, to break public support. It's meant to divert the resources into defense and away from the needs of the people. It's meant to demoralize and to make the governments collapse either from their own mistakes, from disillusionment by the population, from a number of reasons, right? And to cause the governments of the newly liberated countries, again, to focus on defense, to become hyper-vigilant against sabotage and internal subversion, to take shortcuts, to get immediate economic benefits, even if it's short-term thinking rather than long-term thinking. And this has afflicted all of these movements, and the Cubans will be the first to admit that this has been part of the twists and turns of the Cuban Revolution, is figuring out how to navigate these contradictions, right? And at the same time, it's what makes Cuba unique is the ability to maintain that underlying heartbeat of revolutionary ethic. The fact that there are 20,000 Cuban doctors spread around the world, that they've created, mostly in the global south, in poor rural communities, that they've actually designed and created the public health systems of some of these countries, that they have a medical industry, right, that and a medical sector that's among the most advanced in the world, partly thanks to the philosophies of El Doctor Che Guevara, right? And partly because of the adaptations they've made to circumstance. My father, starting in 1961, was very much involved in training generations of farmers and ecologists in non-Western, non-chemical, non-Soviet agriculture, right? How to do regenerative agriculture, which meant a lot of resistance from bureaucrats who were very enamored of the shiny industrial ways of doing things, until the collapse of the Soviet Union made it necessary to adapt these methods as a temporary emergency measure, until it started becoming clear that actually this is better. This is more productive. This is more supportive of rural people. The same has impacted healthcare. The boycott has meant that they've had to adapt to different forms of healthcare. For example, when hurricanes create flooding and spread epidemics, those epidemics are now met with mass programs of homeopathic inoculation. Very low cost, very effective. So that things that they might have resisted, if only they had pivoted toward renewable energy sources before the crisis in global oil had turned that into an existential crisis for Cuba. Right? That's just some of the ways in which these happen, right? It's tough running a country. I mean, recently in the resistance against ICE, one of the really interesting things is that the communities that we are part of fulfill a lot of the functions that a government is supposed to fulfill.
That's right.
Providing safety for people, transportation, food, connection connections to medical support and all the rest, right? Gave us a little taste of what those complexities within a very short, limited period of time. Imagine if our communities were suddenly tasked with actually running an entire system under constant military and economic and propaganda attack. So I want to wind it down here. Oh yeah, and also of course, you know, the impacts on history cannot be touched on without discussing apartheid and the Cuban participation in the wars in Angola that for the first time defeated the South African military and, you know, crushing South African morale and making it clear that they were not invulnerable. Something that is certainly being demonstrated by Israel as well at this moment, not to mention the United States. But I want to suggest that I've thought about this a lot. What is it that we measure to determine is some society that claims to be revolutionary is the real thing or not? And I believe that it has to do with what it gives the people permission to do. I experienced Cuba only once, and that was in 1968. A very turbulent moment for world history. Other members of my family have had more updated experience and watched the evolution. But it certainly implanted in me ideas of possibilities that I had to witness to experience. But does the society you live in give you permission, whatever kind of workplace you're in, whatever kind of research you're doing, whatever kind of educational programs or systems you're operating in, does it give you permission to innovate in the direction of kindness and generosity and meeting people's needs, or give you permission to act in other ways that are subservient to authority? You know, so that even under hardship, even when there are steps backwards, the question is, are these defensive steps that still obscure a deep commitment to move forward? Or are they indications that this is not actually what it claims to be? The intention of the leaders of this movement is a very important factor, but not the only one. For example, I believe that the leaders of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Pol Pot regime, in their own heads believed in their quasi-utopian, although really dystopian vision of a future utopia. But what it gave permission to people to do is essentially to surveil, rat on each other, sacrifice without reward, and obey every edict from those who came from above. Right? So it's really the experience of the people that matters most. One of the things that is very hard to measure is resilience. And this is true in ecological terms. When we talk, even when we're talking about climate change, we know how to measure resilience to some degree on the scale of small systems, but we're constantly surprised when salmon streams regenerate, when coral reefs or mangroves that appear to have been lost regenerate. And when we talk about on a global system, we have no models that large. We're always surprised, and we never really can predict, right? That's why we go ahead and fight, even if things look kind of harsh. That's also true of the fate of the Cuban Revolution. We don't know what is going to happen. We know that a lot has to do with, you know, how successful has imperialism been in depleting the resilience of the population. Of course, attacks from outside always regenerate it, so that even opponents of the Iranian regime are still defending their country because that's what happens. And also what happens in geopolitical terms. You know, what can constrain Trump? What are the balances of power? What will other countries do? The decisions about whether or not to attack Cuba are totally embedded in this geopolitical reality. regardless of what the internal conditions of Cuba are. And I want to end with a quote from Black Panther leader Huey Newton. He said, "The power of the people is greater than the man's technology." And that's something that seems counterintuitive when we have AI systems running amok, when we have surveillance on scales never imagined, when we have all this weaponry. But the question has to be asked, why do they need all that? Right? And the only answer is that they see in us a resilience and a power that we often ourselves don't realize that we have. So the outcomes of these histories, including that of the Cuban Revolution, has not been written. And we're here to not do a cost-benefit analysis, but to simply support resilience rather than depletion. In the same way as if your baby was sick, you don't sort of look at the factors and say, well, is this worth investing our efforts in? You say, I'm going to do whatever the fuck I can to make sure that, you can edit that in the video, to make sure that the desired outcome is achieved.
Open it up for a Q&A, and that can be questions, or also I know there are many of you who are listening who might have some personal reflections living through the Bay of Pigs. Before we do that, I would just like to pass this basket. One thing that Ricardo mentioned was the incredible medical expertise and solidarity that Cuba shows around the world, including right here in Minnesota. We have many ELOM-trained doctors at clinics who accept patients like myself and my son who are on Medicaid and sliding fee scale. The Minnesota Cuba Committee currently has a member in Cuba right now, and I will be traveling to Cuba on Friday and delivering medical supplies and donations to hospitals there. So we're going to pass the hat for that. Thank you. Or the basket, I should say. And now, now we'd like to open it up for a question and answer period. So I think we'd be okay if the people could just raise their hand and ask their question and try to project their voice. We don't have a sound system, but I think it's a small enough room where we can make sure to be heard, and we'll be happy to repeat the question if anybody can't hear it. So, if you want to make a check, you could certainly make one out to Saving Lives. Saving Lives is both the Minnesota Cuba Committee and SCOTA work in coalition with the Saving Lives organization, and you know, we've done various fundraisers to send pacemakers to Cuba through Saving Lives.
Global Health Partners.
Sorry, Global Health Partners.
Global Health Partners.
Thank you, Gary, for the correction.
Yeah,
but
Global Health Partners.
if you write a check, please do not include the word Cuba or Cuba on it anywhere. You can just say Global Health Partners. If you want to put someplace donation, that's okay, but just not the word Cuba. Thank you. Does anybody have a question for either of our speakers?
I'll start if that's okay.
Sure.
So, my name is Teresa Schweitzer, and there's a lot of thoughts running through my mind. I've been to Cuba 4 times, and I currently live in Guatemala, and I've done a little bit of great, fun, nonprofit work with Dr. Maida Argueta, a 51-year-old gal who all of a sudden she's like, Teresita, I got a scholarship and studied in Cuba for 7 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're kidding. So she's one of the thousands of doctors all over the world who has benefited from what Cuba has been able to do. And she's an amazing people's doctor in the country of Guatemala with endless energy. It's really awesome. So I have a question about what everybody thinks about what might happen. Like I said, we don't know, but if we could just discuss maybe when I look at Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, and when I think about, and I'd like to know if anybody else that's been to Cuba had a similar situation. I was there in 1996 for a youth festival, and for students and youth, and the family that I stayed with, they told me that when the revolution happened, everybody was invited to partake in the revolution. And there was no such thing as people having to like escape any danger or violence, but the people who simply were not willing to make their two-story house, a one-story house into two, so that everybody had a place to live, that they were free to go if they wanted to go. So my understanding is that a lot of people just simply left and went to USA, and the USA accepted them. So what might happen if those angry elitists or whoever they are, that Ricardo, you said didn't really have any oomph back then, what could happen if US tries to take over Cuba, and then all of the people who have like this chip on their shoulder for 70 years, that they lost with their elitism and their casinos and their playing games, and just having fun on this paradisal island that now for me is a beacon of beautiful socialism.
We have 3 hours.
Well, yeah, it's again, there's a lot we simply don't know, and that's a part of the negotiations that are going on right now. That crowd in Miami wants their property back.
Yeah, okay.
They want their property back.
Although their grandkids don't necessarily.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But basically, my view is that they will have to go through the Cuban working class to get their property back. That's during that period I was referring to, that first 2 years, an important moment was when the nationalizations took place, and those nationalizations were led by workers who took the initiative, they were called interventions, to begin taking over the factories. A lot of these absentee bosses and so on, they had fled. Sorry, we're taking over.
That's right.
And so for those people to get their property back, it's going to take a fight. That's when I said we don't know how that. There will be a fight, but we can't. I always tell the word inevitable appears in the Communist Manifesto only once, followed immediately by instructions about what the working class has to do to organize itself. All that the manifesto promises is the class struggle, not the winners and the losers. That's all it promises. So there's a big class struggle on the way if those people want their property back.
Thank you.
They're going to have to fight toe-to-toe with the Cuban working class. And how that goes will depend upon leadership issues. The issues around leadership, and again, I think none of us are really in a position to make any predictions about that, other than the fact there will be a fight.
Yeah, so far it seems that a lot of regimes under attack right now have been cozying up and trying to make amends with Washington. That doesn't appear to be the case of the Cuban leadership, because I think they know that that's a rabbit hole you never get to climb back out of. There's a lot of wild cards at the moment that make the current moment even more unpredictable than most. And it also has to do with the ebb and flow that I was talking about of history, right? That every historical moment is a transitional one. It's always between something and something else. So that if the U.S. were to invade Cuba, if they were to be successful, and it wouldn't be easy in establishing their own control, colonial or neo-colonial control, that would be a major setback, but it would also be another moment in the ebb and flow. and that would result, it would change the terms of revolutionary action in Cuba tremendously, but it wouldn't be the end of it, right? Another factor is that many countries have always had a stake in Cuba, even if they don't support revolutionary ideas. It was the fact of the Cuban Revolution allowed other governments in Latin America to dare push for tepid reforms that they otherwise would not have been able to be allowed to do, right? So there's an interest in other countries, also in not empowering Washington to, simply pick off, governments wherever they want, right? What happened in Venezuela is kind of a warning of the idea of, the Don Rovic, doctrine. Also, we have some potential unusual allies in that could mitigate against that kind of full-fledged military assault ever happening, and that's MAGA. That the idea of no endless wars, not hopping around at will and fighting everywhere in the world, was part of the reason that Donald Trump got elected. And after all these other things that are going wrong, that's a major tipping point for many people, right? They don't care what's going on inside Iran or Venezuela or Argentina or the Congo or anywhere else. They just don't want to be engaged in wars there, right? So that we have ways of tipping the balance against Trump himself, because not all of the U.S. elite is excited about having wars everywhere. Now, the military-industrial complex is one of the main pillars of the U.S. economy, but they're also not all powerful, and we just need to be able to find where we hit the chisel into the flint to cause and emphasize these divisions, as well as passing the basket. I mean, anything we can do to support the internal resilience, or even encourage other nations that have the capacity to be a little bit more bold, including what movements in Mexico and other countries can do to simply defy the regime. And the U.S. empire is spread kind of thin right now. And if China starts sending gunboats around Taiwan, they're going to feel even more timid about spreading themselves thinner. So there's a lot that's hopeful in the balance of forces, a lot that's ominous, kind of the way history works. It's very acute right now. High levels of nutrients and toxins, and we're going to make the best of it.
So we're going to take quite a few questions. I'm going to start with the person in the black hat and then kind of move that way, if that's okay.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Given limited time,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we could collect a whole handful of questions,
Oh, nice.
so everyone gets to be heard, and then we can kind of improv with those. Does that sound good to you?
Sure. Okay, sounds good. Do we have any, let's see here, we can get some paper and I'll have people kind of write them down.
Maybe you can just say what their questions are and then.
Okay.
Yeah, just speak them out loud.
Okay, sounds good. So let's start with, right here and kind of move in this direction. Yeah, please.
I was just wondering if there was an update on current conditions in Cuba, in terms of the blackout and the hospitals. I know we heard a lot initially when everything was starting to get crazy again, but considering our crazy news cycles, it's hard to keep up with everything that's going on in Cuba. And then my second question to that would be, do you recommend a specific paper news source to follow so that we can keep up with the current situation on the ground in Cuba?
Thank you. Okay, next question.
Yeah, on the question of what made the Cuban Revolution survive when others didn't, I think, and what made it victorious in a way that was different from other, like the Kino and other. I think that a couple of questions. One is the Cuban leadership was a Marxist leadership, and they also had built a cadre. They had a history going back to the July 26th, and so that there's that whole side of what's important when you look at the world today of leadership. And then the way they conducted themselves, the absolute honesty of the Cuban leadership, and the reliance on mobilizing the people, because of that, the prestige they had won, but because of their honesty and their political program. And then the final thing is, a lot of it, there are important questions in relation to the imperialist powers and Donald Trump and, what's going on there. What's going on in the world is very, very important. In fact, that's one reason why the Cuban Revolution has survived in the way it has, is because Cuba has been internationalist, and the people that have gone out from Cuba to fight in Africa and so on and so forth, it renews their revolutionary spirit. And that's sort of been cut off, recently. But what happens in the world and what happens in the working classes of the imperialist countries, where there's a great deal of social and political crises, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of discontent, there's no leadership in any kind of massive way, but there's so many different factors that can play into it, so I think we also have to have our eyes on that,
Thank you.
Well, I just add, mine's a small point, but but in light of that too, the importance of the solidarity work, the importance of building a solidarity movement internationally, and what an impact it already has made. And we've gotten all kinds of resolutions passed by city councils and unions against the SSOT and for normalizing relations. Every year at the UN, the overwhelming majority of countries support ending the embargo. And many of them identify positively with Cuba's example. And so there's that too. There's that piece that we can't forget, and why it's so important to have solidarity groups and to do this work.
Yeah, thank you.
Should we take two more just to keep it manageable and then move on?
Sure, yep, okay, 2 more questions.
Do you think that the Iran's win, or apparent win at least now, will have any effect on the way people, on Cuba, actually? If the whole world perspective kind of changes and they can see the country can win?
Good question, thank you. And Kevin?
Just getting back to Teresa's question. Well, that's the point, to overturn the new property relations in Cuba. Policy is not made in Miami. The policy on Cuba is made in Washington, D.C. in a totally bipartisan way by both bloodthirsty parties. The real losers in Cuba were U.S. corporations. Who owned the refineries they nationalized? Who owned the most land and most of the sugar mills? Who owned the telephone company? Who owned the banks? Who owned the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's a lawsuit, there's a law in this country that you can sue to get your money if you were one of these poor, unfortunate capitalists. And they're in the process now. One is they're still shareholders of the Havana Docks Company that are suing cruise lines who use those docks, and they want hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, etc. These things are going on now. Well, that's the point, to overturn those property relations and restore the capitalist ones. And that's why what we do here is so important. The Cubans, I'm not worried about the Cubans. They know how to take care of themselves. We saw that 65 years ago. The CIA Air Force was 3 times larger than the Cuban Air Force and had 6 times as many pilots, and whose planes ended up in the ocean, and they fought like tigers. It's our task here to build a broad solidarity movement so that the next time we have meetings like this, they're a little bigger, and the next time a little bigger. And that we reach out to unions, we reach out to everybody to be more students and everything, to be a part of this, and ultimately The best thing we can do is make a revolution here.
Thank you. Can I also add one extra question, just specifically regarding Bay of Pigs? Ricardo mentioned this notion of measuring resilience, and one thing that came to my mind as a question is, do you think there's overlap in that in 1961 the Cubans, were so victorious in defeating U.S. imperialism at the Bay of Pigs, and then simultaneously it was the year that they launched the National Literacy Campaign? So, and I think now maybe do our speakers or people feel comfortable sort of synthesizing some of those questions?
So the question is the resilience.
What is the intersection between defeating U.S. imperialism at the Bay of Pigs and the launch of the National Literacy Campaign in 1961?
Yeah, that's an important question. The revolution made a conscious decision not to suspend the literacy campaign when the Bay of Pigs happened. They said, we declared this, we're going to complete it, and even though we will take the measures to protect, even though we have a couple of brigadistas who lost their lives due to the attacks by the counter-revolutionaries and so on, they made a conscious decision to continue, not let this mercenary intervention undermine a key pillar, social gain of the revolution. I don't know if that's answering your question.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think you are better qualified than I to answer the question about keeping up on current updates and sources of news.
Yeah, just the latest. I can't get into the details about the blackouts and so on. I haven't seen anything. All I do know, there was an article in the Militant last week I thought was informative. I think, that article talked about the last shipment of Soviet petroleum. That's now being refined.
Yes.
But it's going to take about another week or so for that to be refined, in which it will be shipped to the hospitals. They have a priority of where that will.
That's now underway. As of today, that's
Yeah.
underway.
Okay, meaning what's underway?
The delivery of the refined
Okay.
Russian oil.
Okay.
And they can't stop that here in the United States.
No.
Okay, good.
And I believe that there's also a second, the Russian minister of trade has confirmed that there's
There's
a
a second Russian
tanker.
ship that is on the way. It passed through the English Channel. It's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean now.
So I wanted to add, sorry, you have more on that.
Sources of news, August, what would you recommend? Yeah, in terms of from Cuba or?
Walter Lippmann's News Service.
Really?
That is the best. If you want something every day, you make your decision. There's about 40 on the list, but it does grandma. See, it does the Cuban newspaper. It gives you the front page of the youth newspaper. It gives you the front page of grandma, and then it does all translation of the key articles. So if you really want to focus on Cuba alone,
It's called Cuba News.
Cuba News.
Cuba News.
Yeah, it's an IO Groups thing. You can Google it.
You get lots of news, that's why I finally had to get out of it.
But you're selective. You
Every
can
day
read
I
it.
had like 20
Yeah.
articles.
You read what you wish. You read what
Yeah,
you
we
wish.
just read what you wish.
So I wanted to weigh in on the question having to do with going back to the beginning of why Cuba succeeded. Was the question, or comment anyway. And one of the other elements is what Che Guevara called the revolutionary humanism. Even during the Revolutionary War in Cuba, prisoners were treated as allies who hadn't been converted yet, rather than as enemies. They were treated well. They were released, undermining the narrative of the dictatorship about how awful these people were. And in fact, that's a factor that ultimately led to Fidel and the Cuban leadership breaking ties with the Colombian FARC.
Yes.
It was the fact that they mistreated prisoners, that they kidnapped people who had done nothing wrong just for their monetary value, and most importantly, that their philosophy of decade after decade after decade of revolution was asking the Colombian people to pay a price in loss and death and pain that no people should be asked to pay. Is that you need to have a strategy that creates a crisis, leads to an uprising, and seals the deal, right? So this idea of revolutionary humanism embedded means that the process of what you're doing is creating allies rather than terrorizing enemies.
One of the key generals in the victory at the Bay of Pigs had been a general in Batista's army. His name was Jose Ramon Fernandez. He was a group of generals there who disagreed with Batista and the coup. They were arrested, and while they were in prison, members of the July 26th organization, who were also in prison, recruited them to a revolutionary perspective. And that expertise of having been a general, that was crucially important in the victory that took place at the Bay of Pigs. So the importance of reaching out, treating your enemy as humanely. That was crucial in winning over a layer of these officials, generals and so on, who had been in Batista's army, but who wanted an alternative. And so recruitment, reaching out, treating people with dignity.
Yeah, and as far as the question about Iran, what's happening in Iran having an impact, absolutely. Now, if you had an empire run by rational people or military technocrats, the damage that's been done to the U.S. machinery and prestige in Iran would be enough to make them recoil from the idea of any other interventions at this time. The fact that Trump is unhinged,
Yes, exactly, you know,
that he went to Iran because Venezuela looked easy, and having gone to Iran and it not being easy, he might think, well, Cuba is a great way to redeem my ego and prestige because that's going to be easy. And the question is whether there are enough people to dissuade him from that. It's the same way that Reagan, was it, I think, who invaded Grenada after, yeah, we were in a committee on that, after the military base in Lebanon was blown up, you know, and the loss of U.S. soldiers. Like, oh, we got to redeem ourselves with a victory somewhere.
Yeah, regarding Iran, it reminds me of the letter that Che Guevara sent to the Solidarity meeting in 1966 in Havana, saying 1, 2, 3 more Vietnams.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3 more Vietnams. Vietnam was crucial in saving the Cuban Revolution. And if I can just append to that, the importance of proletarian internationalism that Ricardo, the victory in Angola in 1988, as Raul Castro said, was not just a victory for the people of Angola, but it was a victory for the people of Cuba. It's a great speech when those returning troops, he says, if not for Angola, we would not be able to survive. And on his mind was the collapse of the Soviet Union at that moment. A lot of uncertainty about Cuba's survival. And Raul Castro says it's exactly the experience of helping others. When you're able to help others, you're in a strong position to help yourself. And that's what Angola represented. And it explains why the Cubans were able to get through, up until then, the most difficult crisis they had faced. That was the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Cubans called the Special Period. But two things, I think, saved the Cubans through the Special Period. One, Angola, the victory in Angola, the confidence that it gave the Cubans, having done that. Secondly, there had been a big debate in Cuba leading up to the Special Period, something called the rectification campaign that Fidel Castro was leading. And this was a campaign to clear a way or to get rid of some of the bad habits that had been brought in from the Soviet Union. To get rid of them and to go back to the kinds of ideas that Che launched and fought for, especially the question of how do you incentivize people to produce? Do you do it through material incentives or do moral incentives? And in many ways, the proletarian internationalism is where voluntary labor took its refuge. That's where voluntary labor, yeah, all those, and go the 300,000 Cubans who went, that was all voluntary labor. And the importance of providing voluntary labor to help wean people away from the dog-eat-dog values of capitalism. What's in it for me? You're trying to wean people away from that ethic and so on. And it's through voluntary labor, coming to the aid of others and so on. And so, yeah, the Angola experience, Raul Castro was exactly right. He said, Angola saved us. Angola saved us going through that experience.
And the reward of solidarity is solidarity. There's somebody in my life right now who's currently hospitalized and will have to be going home and getting support and can't eat the food in hospital, so people need to bring it. And having spent a life providing support and solidarity to other people, that network is there for them now. And will be there to go and take shifts, you know, in the place where they're living, and be able to bring food and so forth. So that part of the resilience of the Cuban people is embedded in other communities and countries and populations around the world, right? Both because of the direct aid and because of the inspiration. People defend a source of hope, right? And the fact that Cuba has held out this model of, however imperfectly, always striving to improve and always striving to improve in a direction that benefits people, is something that folks don't want to let go of. So, you know, now that means nothing unless it's mobilized and activated, of course, but it's the material that we get to start with.
Can you talk about the role of Cuban 5 and all the solidarity and how inspiring they are?
Yeah, what John is referring to was the campaign that many of us had the opportunity to participate in. 5 Cuban revolutionaries who spent over 15 years in U.S. prisons. They were sent by Cuba. They volunteered to come into the United States to monitor what counter-revolutionary groups were doing inside the United States. They were arrested and life sentences, and they held out. And Washington could not break them to cut a deal to betray the revolution. And people like Joan and others who kept writing letters to them. We played a major role in helping to solidarity and helping to free them. And Fidel said that Fidel's famous line when they got arrested, "They will return," and they did. They will return. They did. It was one of the most important victories in the history of the Cuban Revolution. The 5 heroes, as the Cubans call them.
And specific campaigns like that help people remember who they are. You know, and there's been any number of those in the case of like Elian, right? The international geopolitical custody battle. But again, these campaigns where people feel that their own sovereignty and integrity is at stake reinforce that sense of unity and cohesion.
Just on the question of resilience, we have to recognize that the embargo blockade, its purpose is to make life as difficult for the Cubans as possible with the hope that they will rise up one day to overthrow their revolution. That was from the very beginning. That was the purpose of it, to make life as difficult as possible. And life has been very difficult. We have to take recognition of that fact. The exodus of Cubans, while Cubans did not have risen up to overthrow their revolution, many of them are worn out.
Over 1 million of them, right?
Many of them, this taken a toll on them. And so the number of Cubans who have left and migrated to the United States, so the population is down to about over 1.5 million Cubans have left. Over the course of the last period. I always put that in perspective, and Ricardo knows this better than I do. More than half the population of Puerto Rico is now living in the United States.
And that population and that ebb and flow has been going on since I was little and way before. And it ebbs and flows depending on economic conditions.
Exactly.
So you do get, the backflow, of course, for that to happen with Cuba, conditions have to significantly improve.
But they do get more money, now, sometimes they go to send, so they can send money back to Cuba.
Correct, yeah, of course. Yeah, support that.
We have one more question, do we have time for one more question and then close out? Is that okay?
That's good.
Yeah. So, as somebody who is less familiar with the history of Cuba, I guess with like histories of revolutions and like progress that Cuba made, it's really easy to like look at like the big things like international medicalism, and I think what's sometimes missing in the details, in the fog of war that then gets like weaponized by people trying to like propagandize against like the achievements of Cuba, is just the lives of like the common people and how do they look like after the revolution, and just this like I guess idea that like assumptions that like maybe like the government has done like this or that, but that's the government's work. The people's like completely separated and they're also like being oppressed in some way. So just I guess how do you break that like assumption, and how do you like when there is so much like intentional obstacles like being created, how do you like discover also like the lives of like Cubans?
I mean, the way those who can discover it through personal experience. And that's more difficult now because I wouldn't want to travel now and absorb resources that other people need. But the main antidote to lies is truth, right? Is finding out as much as we can. Who are the common people, right? And how are they navigating these complexities? And to me, more to the point, is how our challenge is addressed and solved, right? So that when under a socialist system like Cuba, when something that people need is scarce, the problem-solving method is how do we make it more abundant and more accessible, whereas the capitalist method is how do we capitalize on scarcity by raising prices.
Exactly.
Right, it's an opportunity for exploitation. When the attendance at rural schools was declining, instead of shutting down the school,